Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining in this webinar that we're focusing on taking you through the findings of the Ramadan that's just passed by. So quite excited about taking you through the findings. And this is Faisal. I am the VP Strategy and Insights at Sila. So I'll tell you about Sila in a brief time, but just to kind of give you context of what I'm going to be talking about today and what this report focuses on. So essentially, there is Ramadan, of course, is all of you in the region know the significance of Ramadan, how important is it to people, and how important is it from a marketing perspective and a communications perspective. We also acknowledge the reality that there is a lot of data that is accessible on the month of Ramadan, right from consumer behaviors to consumption behaviors to what people eat, how they spend their time, etc. Through a lot of discussions and with our clients and organizations, we do realize that while there's a lot of data that's available, and like I said, especially on consumption-driven data on what they're eating, how they're eating, what they're drinking, as well as media consumption is extremely important. But what we realize is that what is missing is how people think, how people feel during this month. What are the activities they're spending time on? And what is the general orientation, frame of mind during the month? And that's what our report focuses on. And that's what we've tried to focus on. And that's what we're going to be taking you through. This becomes important because it gives you direct inputs to a communication strategy in terms of what are the aspects of Ramadan that stay intact, what are the aspects of Ramadan that are changing year on year, what are the aspects of Ramadan that change from demographics. And talking about demographics, one thing that we've intentionally kind of kept our focus on is talking about the youth that is under 30, the Gen Z, how they embody Ramadan and how it's different from how Ramadan is viewed and embodied by the millennials. These are some findings on the slide, very broad takeaways, but I'll kind of skip through this and talk about, as we progress, talk about the actual findings from the deck. How we've structured the report is we're going to give you a brief introduction of the study itself. And for people who are not familiar with Sila, of what Sila does and how we kind of go about research, because that sets context of how we've collected data for the slides that you see and for the data that you see. We talk about Ramadan in general. We do acknowledge and understand that while Ramadan might change year on year, while nuances and manifestations of Ramadan might change year on year, but there is a core element of Ramadan that is spirituality that remains intact, even in times where contexts are changing. Spirituality remains something that's untouched, and we talk about that. But there are some interesting insights that you'll find around that theme also. Section 3 focuses on Gen Z, about the youth shift. A very important section, especially if you're a brand that is targeting the youth, to understand how they're viewing Ramadan, what they're thinking, what they're feeling during Ramadan, how are they engaging with the different activities. The next section then kind of shifts gears and talks about the millennials and what's running on their minds. We leave you towards the end of the deck with some key points that become important for you to incorporate, to consider in your strategies of communication, especially that you kind of cater to the season of Ramadan. So I'll get started with giving you an introduction to the study. And like I said, a lot of you I know are familiar with Sila, but some of you might not be so familiar with Sila. So Sila is a AI-powered consumer intelligence and market research organization. We work with leading brands in the region on their market research needs using AI technology. Essentially, we use a lot of passive data that's available through sources like socials, across social platforms, across Google searches, review platforms. You've also got first-party data, and that becomes our source of data to take forward and analyze to and as interpreted to kind of address certain business and marketing objectives that we do work with our clients. One of the biggest things to highlight about Sila is our Arabic capabilities. So we are the only Arabic native technology, AI technology. And why that becomes important to highlight is how we function is we take all the passive data I was just referring to. We take all that data. That data is assigned in Arabic. The data is all Arabic. That is then assigned a dialect, because we do understand the complexity of the Arabic language. We do understand if something is said in the Saudi dialect versus the Emirati dialect versus the Egyptian, Jordanian dialects, the interpretation changes. So all the data that's collected in Arabic is analyzed from a dialect lens and then interpreted accordingly. And why I'm highlighting this aspect, because anyone else or any other organization that would typically do similar nature of work about using social data or passive data, they typically take Arabic data, translate that into English, and all the interpretation and analysis is done on the English translated version, which hugely compromises the quality. So that's how we function, and that's what we stand for. And that's an important context, because that's how we looked at this report as well. So we collected, while we have capabilities of course, English and other languages as well. But in the case of Ramadan, our focus was on the Arabic speakers. We collected all data that included the word Ramadan from socials, in this case, which is X, Instagram, and TikTok, and looked at data, ran analysis in our proprietary models on that data to understand how Ramadan is being how Ramadan is being embodied across the audiences and different demographics in the region. The other point to highlight here is that how we looked at this report, of course, we give you an understanding of this year's Ramadan, Ramadan 2024, but we've also looked into our past data, which is the months of Ramadan in 2022 and 2023, because that gives you a trended understanding. So we actually had a report published in 2023, which got a lot of media attention, which got a lot of appreciation from our set of clients, and it was used as a document that was inputted into a lot of strategies, and that's actually on their popular request, and on their request is where we decided to kind of publish this report 24 with a more detailed understanding and comparison and contextual understanding versus 22 and 23 23 Ramadans. So here are some numbers. It gives you, the number of posts we've analyzed. So it's big data, it's huge amounts of data. So there's a lot of authenticity and a lot of data that's the findings are backed with. And before we kind of get into some specific aspects of the learnings, just broadly, when I talked about in the previous slide, you saw the number of posts we've kind of analyzed, the number of video content that's been analyzed, everything in the context of Ramadan. So what we did is we mapped that data out across socials, consolidated all the data on Ramadan across socials from a weekly perspective, almost on a daily perspective, day by day, to understand if there are any kind of trends we can notice when we compare it from last year's Ramadan. So this chart that you see is divided in two parts. The first part is Ramadan 23 or Ramadan 22. And then the next part is Ramadan 23, where we're looking at the trends here in terms of year one and year two. The purple line that you see is the views. That is, any views essentially means any video content that people are viewing or posting on Ramadan. And the pink line is any kind of textual data, which is posts. So two big points that we kind of notice here is the proportion of, so we always knew, and this is something which we've, as researchers have said always, that while the month of Ramadan is a month, but the actual preparatory work starts much before Ramadan. So right 2 weeks, 3 weeks before Ramadan is when the actual content of Ramadan starts. And if even in this case, like you see, the confines of Ramadan start much before Ramadan, the month of Ramadan, 2 weeks in advance. So that's something which is no new news. But what is new news is two things here. One thing is, if you look at the proportion of content on Ramadan in the pre-Ramadan phase, that has increased year on year. So if you look at the initial parts here, the purple line, the pink lines here, they're quite flat versus in the second year where they're kind of growing. So the quantum of conversation, the interest, the preparatory work that's happening is starting much before Ramadan, and that is increasing. So as a phase, that becomes much more important than it was ever before. The second thing that to highlight here, if you look at both the charts here, both the sides, both the years, is the purple line, which is the views, the video content. That is becoming more and more important, again, year on year. So your engagement with video content, with Ramadan entertainment-driven content is grown, and you find a new peak versus last year, and you also find initially you find kind of peaks even way in advance just at the start of Ramadan, whereas the number of textual content is kind of reduced. So I think the two big takeaways are your pre-Ramadan phase, while it was always considered to be important, I think that how important it is has changed. It's become much more important. And two, how do you kind of leverage your video content and how that becomes a primary means of engaging with your audiences. The second thing about when I'm talking about the entire content of Ramadan and the content that we looked at, the entire post, what we do is something called the emotions analysis, where we look at all the data and run an analysis to understand. So it's a proprietary model again, which runs a variety of positive and negative emotions to understand what is the emotions uh, a certain topic is kind of driven by. So in this case, Ramadan. So all the data that was related to Ramadan, 95% of that data was positive emotions. And when we break down the positive emotions, 73% was what we call as excitement. And I think that's pretty intuitive because it's a month of celebration, it's a month of feasting, it's a month of togetherness, and it's kind of a universal emotion to have, an association to have with Ramadan. So what we do is we ran the emotions analysis across the different dialects, and dialects is a very good surrogate of nationality. So if there is something that is written, something that is said, and if we assign a dialect to it, it can be safely assumed that this person belongs to that certain nationality. And hence, once we run a dialect analysis on of that all of that data and ran emotion. So we do understand that excitement as emotion spans across all dialects, all nationalities. However, I think one of the points we wanted to highlight here, and this is something we'd like to continue as a theme because it kind of gets manifested in different shapes and forms as we progress through different data points. But when we look at this data versus last year's data, especially in Maghreb and Gulf countries, we do see that the Ramadan this time, or the excitement quotient, is slightly lower than last year. So slightly the Ramadan emotions were more tempered versus last year. And this could be driven by multiple factors, including the fact that you in the Gulf countries as residents are able to celebrate Ramadan in a certain way, where people in other countries in the region may not have the same level of luxury at this point of time because of multiple factors, including geopolitical conditions across the globe. And just before I progress, that becomes important from a communication standpoint because while I talk about it towards the end, just bring it up here also. While you want to show excitement, you also want to build in a quotient of empathy to acknowledge that there are societies, there are people, there are countries which may not necessarily be able to uh, feel the same level of excitement or celebratory frame of mind, and hence weaving that into your strategy becomes important. So I move on. So that was a broad, very big picture kind of the kind of post we've analyzed and what are the overarching themes that are emerging. Now let's get into specific aspects of Ramadan, and there are three sections that we've kind of covered, are aiming to cover in this webinar. The first section is hope and spirituality. This is a very interesting section for two reasons. One thing is we all know that spirituality, so any study you do, irrespective of methodology, any conversation you have around Ramadan, I think spirituality as a theme, as a word becomes important. And any communication you pick out, irrespective of the sector or industry, you will notice how they're trying to bring out the entire essence of spirituality. So that's something that remains intact, it remains untouched. But what do we do see are some manifestations, some nuances within that are changing, that become important, that it become important to consider while we're talking about Ramadan. So bringing it up front here, that spirituality, when we talk about spirituality, 65% of the conversations that we've noticed is spirituality driven. This same number was 69% in our last year's report, so it's dropped by 4%, and we'll see where this 4% is actually going. So when we look at the split here, that what is the other things they're talking about, which is spiritual connection, which I talked about, spirituality, which is a 65%, which I also mentioned, this is dropped 4% versus last year. And that's been taken away by other aspects like sense of community and some other smaller elements that start showing up. But there is a couple of notches. So the sense of community goes a couple of notches up versus last year. And that's again important in how things are shaping up in the region, where there's a stronger sense of community, people coming together and standing there for each other is growing as an element of what people are talking even in the context of Ramadan. Spiritual connection, like I said, has reduced versus last year. So, but that is not the only insight there. When we looked at spiritual connection and broke it down and tried to see how things around within spiritual connection are changing and what's increasing and what's reducing within spiritual connection. So, spiritual connection is broadly divided into three sub themes, which is religious obligation. How religious obligations are defined are essentially your 5 times prayers, your going to the mosque, your Taraweeh prayers. So it's more the obligatory associations with the month of Ramadan. You've got charity, which is zakat, where we know that it's an important element of generally in a life of a Muslim, where charity and zakat become important, and that kind of heightens during the month of Ramadan. What and where this data becomes interesting is spiritual practices. But it's also important to understand and explain what we mean by spiritual practices. It was difficult to give an English word to spiritual practices, but essentially, it is a form of multiple types of discussions that form spiritual practices. But primarily, if I had to sum it up, it's what we call as dua, is where you're praying to God or thanking God or praying to God for something you need or for a better tomorrow, for hope, for a better future. And this aspect of spirituality has gone up versus last year by 9%. So there is a much stronger need to pray to God for hoping for a better future, for a better tomorrow, for more equality, for easing out the difficulties that the community at large might be kind of facing at this point in time. So that's on the larger spirituality aspect. So if I just had to kind of, before moving on to the next section, if I just had to kind of highlight a couple of things and our key takeaways of how we see this spanning out. So I think Ramadan is huge. It remains to be a very happy moment in the people of your audience, in the life of your audience. It's an extremely important month, which the preparations of which start 15, 20 days in advance. It's almost like a 50-day window of marketing opportunities that exist. The emotion of excitement continues to be extremely strong. But having said that, it is, if you again looking at trended data, it is slightly more tempered versus last year. And we do see aspects like dua, spiritual practices increasing versus last year, and sense of community also increasing. So I think from a communication standpoint, what becomes important is to live up to the levels of excitement, live up to the level of the happiness associated, the positive associations with Ramadan. But it also becomes important to acknowledge that it's slightly more tempered. There is a sense of community that is growing. There is a need, a growing need to pray for a better future that's there, and for more, being more empathetic about the lack of opportunities to celebrate Ramadan are not equal across different regions in the world. So that is important to kind of build in how you kind of approach the level of excitement. So our next section is the youth shift, and for all brands targeting people, the audience, Generation Z, people who are under 30, this section is important, where we've highlighted, of course, there's a lot of data that's behind this, but we wanted to highlight some things that are really stand out. And what it is we've got some interesting 3, 4 kind of insights that really drive the Generation Z and how they look at Ramadan. The one big point is around the nostalgia around Ramadan's past, the old nostalgia, basically how they feel about yesteryear's Ramadan and how it was celebrated in the earlier generations, and these guys are not getting the opportunity to celebrate it in the same manner. So there's a very strong sense of nostalgia. And this I'm highlighting because this was a very important theme in our last year's report of Ramadan, where we talked about nostalgia. It was a very important theme, a very important platform that we uncovered, diagnosed, and talked about, and again, which multiple organizations, brands, custodians were able to leverage to build that and weave that into their storytelling. And as we look at this year's report, very interestingly, that emotion has only become much more stronger. So when we look at this year's data versus last year's data, there's a 31% increase in the emotion of how the Generation Z or how the youth feel the sense of nostalgia for Ramadan's past. And if you look at it with comparison with people over 30 and under 30, very clearly under 30, there is, almost a 10% stronger sense of emotion of nostalgia, where they're talking about, how they're yearning for simpler times because how earlier times where your experiences were very different in terms of how families and broader families were able to create memories. So the entire generation to generation, how it's becoming more silo and more nuclear with time, and that's something that the youngsters are missing. How do they kind of cope with that is also interesting to see. They're trying to recreate, redefine Ramadan in their own ways. So they do acknowledge that, hey, we don't have the same Ramadan like our parents had or like our grandparents had. It's not the same family sizes. It's not the same. It's not necessarily the same, sense of bonding or coming together like it always were, or even the rituals. There is still a lot of strong social aspect in the activities we do, but we're very interestingly seeing social activities that are growing year on year with their friends and closer cousins and family members. And the three activities we've picked out, which are significant in the life of the youth in these markets in the Arab world when it comes to Ramadan. So these are specific activities we've captured in the context of Ramadan, and we've given a comparison of 23 versus 24. Some of them we highlighted last year, like gaming. It was highlighted in last year's report also. But if you look at just gaming, 40% as a standalone, as an activity is being mentioned in the context of Ramadan, and that's grown by 15% versus last year, which we highlighted also as a significant number. So gaming is it's an excellent platform to look into, to tap into, to see how you can kind of again build activations or build it in your scheme of things when designing your campaigns around Ramadan, activations around Ramadan. How do you kind of build in gaming as a platform there? Apart from braming, even sports and movies is something we picked up last year. They're also maybe not growing in the same proportion like we see for gaming, but for sure they're growing year on year for in a certain percentage for the youth. And what we see this is basically friend-based activities is something we're calling this, which is growing year on year, which is something which is an excellent kind of platform to tap into, to look into. The other angle is media consumption, and I'm aware of the significance of TV, the significance of a lot of numbers floating around, the channels they watch, the content they watch. Ramadan series are very popular. But when we look at youth in specific, I think what we want to highlight is, while TV is relevant, it's mass, it's very relevant even for the larger audiences, but more older audiences, what we see is a year-on-year increase of video content. So if you look at just TikTok as a means or as a platform, there are 7.5 billion views. And I'm just talking about Ramadan-related content since 2022. So last three Ramadans, including this Ramadan, there are 8 billion views just on Ramadan content. And this becomes a very important aspect because they're shifting or viewing video content, Ramadan content on TikTok, and hence shorter formats versus longer formats of TV and series. And what we did an analysis here, just breaking down all the video content, all the TikTok content on Ramadan by the overall. So what you see on the left side is the overall engagement per post of the overall audience that we analyzed, versus just we looked at people who are under 20 years old who are engaging with this. And we do understand that as a platform, it's a younger platform. But I think the more importantly, the average engagement or people that are engaging, the youngsters that are engaging with TikTok Ramadan content is almost double of the overall size. So again, if you're targeting your Generation Z, you're targeting your youngsters, you're targeting your youth, it becomes an extremely important aspect to leverage in your Ramadan content that you're building. So that was talking about youth. I think if I had to, before moving on, if I had to kind of highlight a few points around the youth, I think from our perspective, like I said, there's a lot of data, but for us, the things that stand out are the theme of nostalgia continues to be important, like we highlighted last year, but is only become more important. There's so much that can be done around building nostalgia and how you're not able to celebrate or spend Ramadan like the earlier generations were. The second aspect is more from an activation perspective is how things like friend-based activities is growing year on year, which is gaming and which is aspects like movies and even sports. But gaming to me stands out with the sheer number as standalone and how the percentage growth from a 25 to 40%. And the last point would be media consumption, where your shorter formats of media content perhaps are challenging the mass media, and the youth today are more looking at more Ramadan content on platforms like TikTok, and hence your digital strategy needs to take that into account. Moving lenses, talking about millennials. When I'm talking millennials, how we've defined it is we're now looking at kind of slightly the not older, but the people who are more than 30 years old, and comparing it with how we saw the people who are younger than 30. And I think the one thing that stands out when we were looking at the entire data is the conversations around the financial impact. So there is evident and very clearly expressed concern, worries, apprehensions around the financial impact of Ramadan. This is also something we pointed out in our last report, but I think very interesting, this has come down. This has come down by 7%. Having said that, it still is a huge number. So 72%, 30 to 40 years old, are expressing their worries around the financial impact of Ramadan. We looked at specific budgets and budgetary concerns, and we try to compare that data point with people who are over 30 and under 30. And again, the way we see it, there's again a very clear difference, right? So your under 30 year youth are not worried about your budgets, about financial implications. It is very, very much prominent on your older audiences. And this is when we looked at the data, this is driven by multiple factors. Interesting, a lot of those factors are ritualistic in nature. So you're talking about gifting, you're talking about inviting people for iftar, so you're talking about going out and eating out, or ordering in, and generally even conversations related to inflation and higher prices are there. So this is something which is weighing heavily on them, and hence again from an opportunity perspective, value propositions become very important, because you're also, let's not forget, your basket sizes, your shopping basket sizes in Ramadan multiply versus any other month during the year. So you're anyway spending much on regular grocery, but also you're giving much more charity. You're also giving much more. You're also eating out much more. You're also kind of gifting much more. You're feasting. So hence that financial impact continues to be a big number, even though it's reduced from what we saw last year. And like I was talking about, traditions, rituals, a lot of the traditions we talk about in Ramadan have cost implications. So what we're trying to do is some correlatory exercises, try to see that are there any other correlations we can do with other data points to see where these financial burdens are coming from for the millennials. And traditions is something which we see again where the importance or the significance of traditions for your younger and older are very different. So your younger audiences are not so much actively thinking about traditions or rituals. Like, for example, I talked about gifting. Let's say this is one example, gifting, versus the older audience who are actively thinking about traditions and following rituals and kind of living to those traditional rituals. And if you think about it, that's what's weighing heavy on them, because all of them come with a price tag. And why we're highlighting this is, one, of course, there's a strong correlation of the financial worries with the traditions you've been following year on year. But if this number continues to be a big number, we do see it reducing. But if the financial worries, the budgetary worries continue to be a large number year on year, we might experience the traditional rituals to get challenged, or see different nuances and manifestations of how the traditional rituals might come to life, or how they're practiced, or how they kind of come across, especially the ones which have a price associated with, like gifting, or even your monthly shopping and shopping baskets might be challenged, or at least they're going to be looking for value proposition. So in a regular day, I might not actively be looking for a discount, versus I would be looking for something actively during Ramadan. So that's our core findings. And like I said, there's a huge data set that we're sitting on, where multiple analysis, category specific, non-category specifics is possible to do. But for the purpose of this webinar, I wanted to kind of leave you behind what's really the soul of this Ramadan, how it's been, what are your audiences in the region thinking, feeling, doing, and kind of talking about specific aspects of the youth and the millennials. So that's your strategies can be kind of catered around specific audiences you're targeting. Before I do and or take up any questions, if there are any, I'm going to be talking about and looking into some of the action points that we want to kind of talk about. So I think Ramadan, people don't change. We always say that, and Sila, we've always had these internal conversations that people don't necessarily change, their context changes. And similarly, when the people's general attitude towards Ramadan will not change, it remains untouched, and that's the entire spiritual element. But what does change is the context. And in this case, it's the modern context. So it's the same Ramadan, the same spirituality, but in a more modern context, an audience that's more digital, where your social pressures are different, where your economic uncertainties are also different versus yesteryear's Ramadan. So, and in that modern context, how do we look at Ramadan of 2024, and how does that impact your next year's strategy when you kind of go about and focus on building your strategy for Ramadan? So I've got some 5 points highlighted here. I think the first point is about communication tactics. It's about how you're reaching out to your audiences. And in this modern context, entertainment-based digital platforms, for example, TikTok, Snapchat, or amongst it could be other aspects, but it's about reallocating, relooking at budgets to seeing how do I kind of focus on how driving the entire content of Ramadan, not the entire, but a proportion, a significant shifting the proportion of my Ramadan content on digital platforms, because that becomes a critical engagement tool with your young Arab youth. The second point we want to leave you behind is the communications activation. Like we've seen, and I've mentioned this a couple of times during the discussion as I was taking through the webinar, is there are aspects like social activities, friend-based activities, gaming, sports, movies, and in specific, again, highlighting and giving unbiased attention here to gaming as a platform. How do you kind of use that from an activation events perspective, and how do you weave that into your Ramadan storytelling for your brand? The third aspect becomes about the communication positioning, because as a platform, we continue to believe, while we talked about spirituality being important, uh, traditional values being important, but there's a strong element of nostalgia. There are brands in the past who have leveraged this, but I think it's still a very much untapped space from a larger thematic perspective, because there is still a very strong growing, like we did see in the data, that there's a 31% higher sense of a growing emotion of nostalgia if we kind of look into data, and how they're missing how earlier generations celebrated and were together in their Ramadan celebrations. The fourth point is around value proposition, more from a specific perspective of your shoppers, of your millennials who actually go out and spend the money, and who do the shopping, who are feeling the financial pressures. And that is something that needs to be seen, considered as an aspect of any kind of planning, because there is a clear and evident and a prominent financial budgetary worry that these guys are constantly thinking about while they're getting into Ramadan from the start till the end. And the last point is a communication tonality, and this is slightly a tricky one, because there's a lot of positive vibe. And I started the presentation by saying, there's a lot of positive vibe. There's a lot of excitement. Excitement is the most important emotion, and it is the most important emotion across nationalities. But we do see that it's slightly more tempered when comes from trended data, slightly more tempered versus last year. And there is and when you look at and correlate it with data, like we were seeing about how spirituality, how the sense of community is growing, how the definition of spirituality is changing, where spirituality was more about religious obligations last year, but right now there's an evidently growing need for a prayer and a desire of a better future, of hope. Hope is a important word, I guess, for hope, and that sense is growing. So you want to balance out the level of excitement, the positivity around Ramadan, the celebrations of Ramadan, but also be build in that element of hope, of equality, of equal celebratory conditions across the globe. So that's our deck. We've You can always reach out to us for more. and how we can kind of look into other aspects of Ramadan or even beyond. But like I said, the objective here is to kind of give you cues of what's Ramadan, how your audiences are thinking, feeling, and doing during Ramadan. And I'll just see if there are any questions here. Okay, we have a question from Ziad. What is the share of Ramadan related views on TikTok versus total views on TikTok since 2022? I can give you that breakdown. Essentially, it's growing year on year. I don't remember the percentage, but we're almost seeing it growing at a 20% rate, if that's an approximate I'm giving you, but that's something that's growing on year, where your views on TikTok is kind of increasing year on year. Uh, and I think you're also asking total views outside the month. That's a calculation I can get back to you on, Ziad. So for sure, that's noted. So I think what you're asking is that what is the proportion of, or the average of any other month, regular non-Ramadan month of TikTok versus on Ramadan, and I can give you that number. I do know that the number of Ramadan is much higher because your consumption per se increases in Ramadan, but that's something I can confirm as we in the coming days. That's a calculation we can always do, and that's handily is available to us. And I think that's it. We had that one question, and I'll wait to hear from you. If there are any questions, please feel free to send it on our info ID, my ID. We'll also be forwarding the links of this presentation as well as a summary of this deck, and you'll have access to the recorded version. Thank you very much. Thanks for your time.